In the most remote jungles on the planet, where maps say unknown territory, soldiers trained to survive any war disappeared without a trace. They weren't killed by a bullet. They weren't killed by disease. What killed them had been waiting for them for centuries in the dark. These are not stories. These are not legends. These are real cases of military personnel who ventured into the jungle and never returned. What you are about to see actually happened. We start in Brazil, in the heart of the Amazon, a region so dense, so dark, so silent, that the military maps of the time simply left it blank. In 1925, British Colonel Percy Fawcett, a veteran explorer obsessed with finding a lost city in the Amazon, ventured into the jungle along with his son and a friend. No one ever heard from them again. The world demanded answers, and governments sent the only thing they had to find them: soldiers. What no one calculated is that those soldiers wouldn't return either. During the following years, the Brazilian army organized multiple search expeditions into the Mato Grosso, trained teams armed with resources, men who knew perfectly well what kind of terrain they were operating in. And yet, several of those teams never returned intact. Some didn't return at all. The area was inhabited by the Carabayo, a tribe with a well-defined territory and a very clear warning for anyone who crossed it without permission. The military crossed it anyway. The testimonies that survived are disturbing. Soldiers who described being followed for days without seeing anyone. Camps waking up with signs of intruders. Comrades who went out to do night guard duty and simply didn't come back. But the testimony that chilled the blood of investigators came decades later. A military expedition from the 1950s managed to make direct contact with the Carabayo, and through an interpreter, the tribe's elders confirmed something that governments had been trying to silence for years. They had seen the soldiers, they had followed them, and when those men fell exhausted, unable to defend themselves, the Carabayo made a decision that responded to centuries of tradition. The remains were never repatriated. The military files of those missions remain partially classified to this day, and the Mato Grosso remains, even in the 21st century, one of the areas with the highest number of unexplained missing persons in all of South America. Brazil was only the beginning, because just a few years later, on the other side of the world, a world war would lead thousands of soldiers into a jungle that hid a danger no military manual had ever contemplated. World War II, 1943. While Europe burned in trenches and bombings, on the other side of the planet, a completely different battle was being fought. A battle where the enemy didn't come from the front, it came from the jungle. Papua New Guinea, an island so remote, so dense, so impenetrable that not even the most powerful army in the world really knew what was inside. The Allies needed it strategically, the Japanese did too, and both sent their men to take it. But there was something that neither side had contemplated in their operational maps. Papua New Guinea was inhabited by dozens of isolated tribes, among them the Kuku, also known as the Anga, a tribe that had been feared by their own indigenous neighbors for centuries. And that did not distinguish between allies and enemies. The first reports came from the Japanese side, entire patrols that went out to explore routes in the jungle and simply didn't return. At first, Japanese commanders attributed it to Allied ambushes, but the Allies reported the exact same thing: soldiers missing in sectors where there was no enemy activity recorded. It was an Australian officer who began to connect the dots. The sectors where the soldiers were disappearing coincided exactly with the traditional territory of the Kuku, a tribe that had a very specific practice with enemies who fell into their territory. They consumed them ritually, not out of hunger. but because they believed that by doing so, they absorbed the strength and spirit of the fallen. For them, an armed soldier was the most powerful enemy they had ever seen, and they wanted that strength. The Australian Army documented several of these incidents, but the information was quickly classified. Publicly admitting that their soldiers had been devoured in the middle of a world war was something no government was willing to do. The exact numbers were never revealed, but veterans who survived the Papua campaign spoke decades later of companions that the jungle swallowed up, without a single enemy bullet having anything to do with it. But if Papua New Guinea was a nightmare for the soldiers of World War II, what the American Green Berets lived through just 2 decades later in the jungles of Vietnam was something no training in the world could prepare them for. And these were no conventional missions. The year was 1965, and the Green Berets were operating in areas that didn't even appear on official military maps, specifically on the border between Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, a region where the enemy wasn't just the Viet Cong.
We're taking heavy casualties. Keep firing! Where is it coming from?
That region was territory to tribes that had been without contact with the outside world for centuries. Tribes that knew nothing of world wars, communism, or democracy. They only knew that strange armed men were crossing their territory. And that was enough reason to act. The first internal reports from the U.S. military described inexplicable disappearances in sectors where there was no confirmed presence of the Viet Cong, patrols that entered forested areas on the Cambodian border and never established contact back. At first, it was assumed they had been captured, then it was assumed they had died in combat, but the bodies never appeared. It was an operative who managed to get out of one of those zones who gave the first disturbing testimony. He described how his unit had been followed for 3 days without seeing anyone, only sounds, branches moving, signs on the trees that weren't there the night before. And then, in the darkness of the 3rd night, they attacked. Not with firearms, with spears, with arrows, with a precision and a knowledge of the terrain that left the soldiers completely disoriented. Several fell before they could react. And what they found at dawn on the perimeter of the camp was never included in official reports. The archives partially declassified in the 1990s reveal references to encounters with unidentified hostile populations in border zones. A very careful way to describe something the Pentagon never wanted to name directly. To this day, there are families of American soldiers who never received an official explanation of how their children died in those jungles. Only a letter from the government that said, "Missing in action." Vietnam left wounds that never closed. But on the other side of the world, in the jungles of Indonesia, the army of a country was facing something just as dark. Indonesia, 1970. The government had just officially annexed West Papua and needed total control over that territory. So it did what any government would do in that situation. It sent the army. What that army found inside was not in any military briefing. West Papua was, and still remains, one of the most biodiverse and least explored places on the planet. But it wasn't empty. In the deepest part of that jungle lived the Carabayo, a people who up to that moment had practically zero contact with the modern world. No radios, no roads, no notion whatsoever that a government existed that had just claimed their land as its own. For the Carabayo, those soldiers were not representatives of a state, they were invaders. The first military patrols that ventured into Carabayo territory began to report something unsettling. The constant feeling of being watched, traps on the paths that could not have been placed by animals. And at night, torches flickering between the trees at distances impossible to pin down. Then men began to disappear, always at night, always in silence, without gunshots, without signs of a struggle, as if something had extracted them from the camp without leaving a trace. When anthropologists finally managed to establish contact with the Carabayo years later, they discovered something that explained everything. The Carabayo practiced ritual cannibalism, not as an act of survival, but as a response to what they called Papua, the presence of an evil that had to be eliminated and consumed to neutralize its power. And for the Carabayo, those armed soldiers invading their jungle fit perfectly into that category. The Indonesian army never published official casualty figures for those operations, but ex-military personnel who participated in those campaigns described scenes decades later that no conventional war veteran could imagine. Comrades found, or rather, what was left of them, a few kilometers from the camp. The case of the Carabayo became over time one of the most documented by anthropologists all over the world. Not because cannibalism was a secret, but because they were among the last peoples in whom this practice was ethnographically confirmed in the 20th century, which means that while the world looked away, it was actually happening. 4 cases, 4 jungles, 4 armies that entered confident and left, those who could leave, with a truth that no military manual contemplates. But there is one left, and perhaps it is the most disturbing of all, because it happened on the same continent where it all began. Colombia, late 1980s, the country was on fire. The Medellin cartel, the guerrilla, drug trafficking. The Colombian army had battlefronts in all directions, but there was an area that even the most experienced guerrilla fighters avoided: the deep Amazon, the triple border between Colombia, Brazil, and Peru. A region so remote that neither the cartel nor the FARC dared to operate there comfortably, and there is a very concrete reason for that. In that stretch of jungle lived, and still live, some of the most isolated peoples on the planet. Among them, the Yuri, also known as the Carabayo, a people about whom so little is known that the Colombian government itself officially classifies them as an uncontacted people, which means that any attempt to approach is at your own risk. The Colombian army learned it the hard way. During reconnaissance operations in that area in the late 80s and early 90s, several military units reported hostile contact with unidentified indigenous groups. They weren't guerrillas. They didn't use firearms. But their knowledge of the terrain was so absolute, so perfect, that they made trained soldiers look like complete strangers on their own planet. A non-commissioned officer who participated in one of those missions and who asked to keep his identity private recounted years later what his unit found on a bank of the Pure River, the remains of what appeared to be a previous military camp. Equipment, boots, personal belongings, but no body, no sign of conventional combat. Only silence and scattered human remains that told a story that no one wanted to read out loud. Subsequent investigations by missionaries and anthropologists who managed to get close to the area confirmed that the Carabayo had ritual practices with the bodies of those they considered invaders of their territory. Practices that included the ritual consumption of parts of the body as a way of appropriating the power of the fallen enemy. The Colombian government responded to these reports the only way governments know how to respond to these kinds of situations: by classifying the information, declaring the area as a special protection zone, and banning any unauthorized entry into Carabayo territory. A ban that remains in effect to this day, which inevitably generates a question that no official has wanted to answer officially. Who exactly are they protecting? The indigenous people, or those who dare to enter? jungles, 5 encounters that governments preferred to silence rather than admit. Soldiers trained to face any war, who found something for which no war had prepared them. And as long as these stories remain classified, as long as those jungles stand, as long as those peoples remain inside, the question is not whether it will happen again. The question is when.